creating cultural awareness and understanding. This is Culture Clique. Culture Clique is written and produced by KQAL-FM on the campus of Winona State University.
Today on Culture Clique, we continue our series on the legalization of recreational marijuana in Minnesota. We're joined by members of government and law enforcement to discuss the still uncertain state of marijuana 8 months after the legalization on August 1st, 2023. Join us as we clear the air surrounding marijuana on today's Culture Clique. Our first guest is Mayor Scott Sherman. I'm joined here in the studio by Mayor Sherman. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Giovanni.
All right, well, thank you for coming. Is there anything Winona can do regarding the ongoing legislation? Has the state been asking small communities like Winona what their thoughts are?
They haven't really been asking us what we can do. A lot of the legislation that came down last August was primarily in regard to the ability to sell it at retail. One of the things that was dictated to us is that due to population size of Winona, which is about 26,500, we would be required to have at least two retail areas specifically designated to marijuana sales. We can't go less than that based on our population size, but we are allowed to go above that if deemed necessary by each municipality.
Why is the state requiring a minimum of recreational marijuana distributors?
I would totally have to speculate, but my guess would be that they don't want to have kind of these, I would almost refrain from using this phrase, but kind of a marijuana desert. You know, they wouldn't want all the business going to one city. Like in Winona here, we have Goodview, which is a smaller suburb of Winona, you could call it. And in that regard, maybe Goodview would block it and Winona would allow it, or vice versa, and then it would potentially create some economic issues in terms of being able to move forward on allowing for marijuana sales within a municipality.
Well, it's speaking of the local areas and whether or not they would ban it or not, I looked into some of the ordinances in Winona. And I know that under current ordinances, you can't do things like smoke or drink at public places like parks and stuff like that. So has there been a discussion about this for marijuana?
Absolutely, yes. In August, we had brought forth an agenda item looking at that specifically. And in Winona, in public places, you are allowed to smoke marijuana and or use edibles or drink a seltzer in that case in our public spaces. That would include sidewalks, parks. The real restriction, or the only real restriction, would be within, I believe, 200 feet of a doorway of a business, and then also within a certain radius of a youth center or school, someplace where youth could potentially be impacted by its use in a public setting. So,
just for a hypothetical, you could say, drink a seltzer at a baseball game, but if it's like a minor league baseball game, it would not be allowed, correct?
Correct. If it was like a youth baseball game, then that's correct. One thing that we discovered, a lot of times when we're looking at our ordinances, which are essentially laws, just another word for laws within our community, we have found some discrepancies. We were looking at it from a comparison to just regular tobacco smoke, and then also alcohol restrictions that we have within the city. And our overarching city ordinance essentially says that public spaces you are not allowed to drink and or smoke, but some parks were allowing that. A good example of that would be our softball fields down on East Lake. Within the city ordinance, you're not allowed to drink there.
Right.
But within the park ordinance, you are allowed to drink there. And for many years, many people who play softball out there have been having a beer while they're playing softball or after the game. That came to light as we were looking at marijuana restrictions, and we're going to be moving forward and trying to align both the city ordinance as well as the park ordinance to try to bring some consistency to that. So like certain park facilities like Holzinger Lodge, for example, you're allowed to drink there. You can't smoke within the building, but you can smoke, like, let's say, a cigar or a cigarette outside. But under the city ordinance, it wasn't allowed. So we're going to have to try and streamline that or make it more consistent, so that in certain areas it is allowed, in other areas it is not. But when we were looking at the marijuana ordinance and how that could potentially apply to public spaces, that was one thing that we did notice that needed some cleaning up, just from old ordinances that had been in place long beyond the lifespan of any of our council members or city staff. So we weren't aware of it, and those things come up from time to time where we'll notice, an ordinance from 1887 that needs to be redone to bring it up to date, and then also in line with other ordinances so they don't conflict.
So it kind of sounds like when it comes to marijuana, you want to put it on the same par as alcohol and cigarettes. Not exactly, but to the most part, where it's like, yes, it's free for people to use, but it's going to be under the same restrictions as alcohol and tobacco when it comes to public use and indoor locations and stuff like that.
I think that's probably the most reasonable way to look at it. I can't speak for all of council. There are some council members that are adamantly against it and think that legislation should be rolled back at the state level as well, but that's a different discussion with the state legislator. But from a municipal level, right now we are going by state guidelines as to what is allowed, and then also we want to be cognizant of the impacts that it might have. Smoking in general can be pervasive. Someone could have a cigarette sometimes a block away, and if the wind's rolling the right way, you'll smell it. Same with a cigar. Same thing with marijuana smoke in this case. And so we want to be cognizant of the fact that it can be pervasive. Something like a seltzer, an edible, obviously is not as pervasive, and might not even be noticed in a crowded setting. But we do want to look at what opportunities and then also what restrictions we might have to put on it moving forward. At this point right now, we're really just waiting for the state marijuana board to get together and create more legislation around that. As of now, we're in a holding pattern, just kind of waiting to see how it goes. I can say that since last August, when it did become legal to smoke in public places within the state of Minnesota, our police have had almost no calls or need to respond to anything that would have been considered pervasive. Right,
and I did speak to some of the officers nearby, and they told me this about the same as what you did. Do you know when the state board is planned to meet?
I do not. There was, from my understanding, kind of a hiccup. They had named someone as the chair or the director of that department within the state of Minnesota, and it sounds like they had to go through that process again. So I don't know when that would be coming through, but from the last that we had heard last August and going into the fall, we had heard that sometime this year that they would have that state marijuana board put together to help develop some of the rules and regulations behind primarily the retail sale of THC products within the state of Minnesota.
All right, and I do want to get into a little bit of the selling here in Winona. We border with Wisconsin, who still has it illegal recreationally. Mm-hmm. Is there concern about potential, I'm not sure if smuggling would be the correct word, it comes off a little aggressive, but smuggling of marijuana into Wisconsin?
I would assume that there is some worry of that from the Wisconsin side. Some states, for many years have been legal. Let's say Colorado or California, who are kind of the first states that made recreational marijuana legal. Illinois did it a few years ago, and so in that regard, Wisconsin has experience with a neighboring state allowing recreational sale of recreational THC products, and I would think that they would probably do the same here. To a certain degree, for many years, Minnesota did not allow alcohol sales on Sundays, and so many people would go over to Wisconsin to buy alcohol products on Sundays because they couldn't buy them here. And so in that regard, yes, there's always that I would say that concern or that thought process that a neighboring state, or since we're so close, it might become a problem. I don't know if it will, but I don't know that it's necessarily our concern here in the city of Winona.
That's fair. And I bring it up because every state surrounding Minnesota currently has recreational marijuana still banned in, and the only other place, which is Canada, you can't get across the border because that's a violation of federal law.
Sure.
So we have businesses here who are going to start selling it, or are planning to, at least in the next year. And we have medical facilities for medical marijuana. And it brings the question, how are they getting their supplies if there doesn't seem to be a legal way to get it within the state of Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's above my pay grade, quite honestly. That would be more of a question for state legislators and then also state law enforcement. How do they want to approach that? I'm sure that's part of the discussion. I know within our own police department, when it was made legal in the state of Minnesota, they had discussions about, how are we going to handle certain situations? Even the training for like our canine dogs. How's that going to change? Do we stop having our dogs sniff out marijuana products, even though they've been trained to do so? Are they still indicating those? So there's going to be challenges along the way. I think with anything new, there's going to be, challenges that aren't really considered by the general public, but law enforcement has to look at them, and then also our elected officials and the staffs within our municipalities, our counties, and the state are going to have to look at developing methodologies to make sure that it is a fair and open process, but also that it's making sure that people are operating within the guidelines that are dictated by the state.
I want to dive a little more into the economic factor when it comes to marijuana. So we're going to have at least 2 facilities here within Winona.
Mm-hmm.
How do you expect that to affect the local economy, especially during things like, say, during all the festivals we have here, whether it be music festivals or actually I think we mostly have music festivals here, but during, like, say, the art walk and stuff like that?
Sure, absolutely. I think in general, economic development is something that most people within the city of Winona deem as a benefit to the community in a variety of ways. I guess the way I like to look at it is it's another widget, so whether it's a toy store or a grocery store or a liquor store, it will be something along the lines more like an alcohol liquor store. Some cities have municipal liquor stores, and they don't allow that privatization of that business within their municipality. I know there has been some discussion at the state level, and then also in some of the mayor's groups that I've been in, discussion about municipal marijuana stores. We won't have that in Winona because we don't run a municipal liquor store. We don't have those types of ordinances in place, but it is something that in general I look at it as just another economic opportunity. And hopefully if it's done right and it's, governed by the state in terms of, making sure they pay their taxes and making sure that they're doing their books right and all of that stuff. And then they're not selling to minors, they're carding and all that. If they're doing it within the guidelines of the laws within the state, then I see it as just another business in that regard.
All right, and finally, where do you see the legislation of marijuana going when it comes to the state of Minnesota, given that there's a lot of gray area and uncertainty right now?
Quite honestly, they need to look at the other states that have been doing it for a while and try to see what has worked and what has not worked and try to bring that to Minnesota. I think, a lot of times if, like in this case, Minnesota is kind of late to the game. There's quite a few states around our nation that do allow it or have made it legal. They've been through these processes already, and I would assume that the Minnesota State Board would be looking at successes and failures of other states in their processes or in their governing of that type of sale of of THC products. I think hopefully it'll be better than what some other states did, and then potentially we won't have to go through some of the issues that have come up because of legalization in other states as well. So tax pieces and the taxation piece, and then just the retail piece as to how they restrict it to adults, because this is an adult recreational marijuana law. So making sure that it doesn't get into the hands of youth, that is, I think, an important part of it, and I think most of our community would be acutely aware of that.
All right, well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time, Giovanni.
Our next guest is Merone Melekin from the Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management.
My name is Merone Melekin, and I'm the Director of Outreach here at the Office of Cannabis Management. The Office of Cannabis Management is essentially the chief regulatory office for adult use cannabis in Minnesota. So we really have that unique task of taking the law that was passed in 2023 and working alongside our sister agencies and really the enterprise in putting what that law said into action. And so we're really kind of like the operating force that has to take what the law says, translate it, and make sure that we can operationalize it so that we can have an adult use cannabis in Minnesota.
All right. Well, that's a great rundown. I do have a few questions in regards to some of the stuff I've read from your website. But before I get into that, I heard from some of the local businesses that you actually have a survey that goes out to these businesses to ask them, what do they think or their ideas on how to go about getting recreational marijuana in Minnesota. My first question is that true?
So we, I would take a step back and say that we had a rulemaking survey. So at the, I want to say it started in 2023. Part of what we have to do is we have to establish the guidelines, the rules, the operating plans, essentially, and principles for how people will essentially participate in this industry. And part of that requires us to develop rules. And so what we did is we identified a number of specific subject matter areas that were really written into the legislation where we have to delve in a little deeper and establish those rules. And so we have surveys that have gone out. I want to say there was about 7 surveys that went out where prospective business owners, subject matter experts, whomever, really it was kind of just sent out, I'd say, very broadly and publicized and such, where folks can opt in and essentially give us feedback, things that they're concerned about. Maybe it's thinking about like the actual operating principles and like the details that we have to get into when it comes to the actual development of the rules and, how do we operationalize some of these different subject matter areas. And so as a result, we produced 7 surveys in which folks, which could have been business owners, could have really been all sorts of different people from the state and beyond, to provide some of that input. And essentially that input allows us to be able to take it and really begin to think deeply into what are the different pieces that we want to put into rules and what is some of that subject matter expertise that's already out there that is telling us kind of how to do this and how do we follow up with those same people and make sure that as we begin drafting that it's really informed based off of what business owners are saying, what subject matter experts are saying, what people in different industries that can relate to cannabis are saying that can kind of allow us to do this effectively and make sure that, we're not recreating the wheel, but we're taking what we know from other industries to help inform this work.
All right, then. Is there any feedback that you got that is consistent or any big ideas that were kind of consistent across the board? Or maybe things that you didn't expect that became a pattern? Yeah,
there's a lot of just interest, and I'd say this goes not only within our surveys, but also in our outreach and engagement efforts. Is one, there are a lot of people that are extremely dedicated in this industry, people that want to make sure that Minnesota has a robust industry, that it is equitable, that it is essentially doing what the legislation intended to do, which was also like repairing some of the historical harm due to prohibition and such. And so there is a number of pieces around that. There's a number of folks that are very interested in ensuring that there are, protections for our medical patients and ensuring that, that there isn't disruption when it comes to medical patients being able to continue to receive the services that they want and that they need, as well as, people just wanting to ensure that, there is enough space for the different people that want to enter into the industry and that there are enough opportunities that are available to people. And so I'd say just generally speaking, there is a lot of excitement and a lot of people that are very curious about what is the process and such, but a lot of people that want to see it done right and thankfully, folks that are working with us that are, taking what they've learned from other states or taking what they've learned from other industries and being able to kind of help inform this new industry as we're developing it together.
Another part of this question is some of the restrictions that are already up on your website. For example, restrictions for people to have 2 ounces in public and 8 ounces for the concentrate. And of course, they can't. People can't have more than 2 pounds of cannabis flower in their private residence. Why are these restrictions in place?
Definitely. So I'll say that this legislation, just as and as you already know this as well, is we're the 23rd state to have done this. And so a lot of what was built into the legislation is really informed based off of what's happened in other states and, what is kind of that standard and what we can learn, especially as we're introducing this to our state. Why were these various numbers and such put in place? I would say that lawmakers more than likely were informed based off of other states and what they saw as, a standard of what makes sense. And, how do we continue to kind of maintain that standard, especially as we're introducing it here.
I know that one other restriction is on private homes where they can't have more than 8 mature plants. Oh, no, they cannot have more than 8 plants. 4 at most can be mature. But they also have to be, and this is a quote directly from the website, enclosed or locked in a space that is not in public view. So I'd like to ask for the reasoning behind that.
So that, again, I think kind of one of those just kind of general standards and such when it comes to home grow. I think that is, in fact, what is written within the legislation and such. The root of it all, adult use cannabis, it's meant for people that are 21 and older. And so when recognizing that, if it is not in an enclosed space or if it was, available to somebody that is potentially under the age, that could be potential harm. And so I think those are really the types of things that we kind of think about when we're talking about how, we want to make sure it's in enclosed spaces. We want to make sure that it's not open for public view or that, people can't just go and have access to it and whatnot, as well as just recognizing that it's property as well. And so I think that was kind of most likely the sentiment that folks had when thinking about kind of what does that restriction look like and how can people do this in their homes, but make sure that they're doing it, within their private residence and without the potential of disrupting somebody else or, young people getting access to it, so on and so forth.
Or I was talking to the mayor here in Winona, and one of the requirements for Winona, at least because of our population, is to have at least 2 dispensaries within the city. And apparently it's different from city to city based on the overall population of that location. But I'd like to know, what is the reasoning? Why is there a requirement or minimum for dispensaries in different locations?
Yeah, the way in which that we are approaching this is recognizing that there are a number of people that want to enter into this industry and going to access it from different spaces. And the way in which it was written in the law is that it is to ensure that there is kind of a distribution. It's really looking at what is that population and, what is an appropriate amount. I think we also equally recognize that we don't necessarily want the flooding of, various businesses and such too. And so how do you kind of manage what that can look like? We also recognize that there's an extremely large interest of folks that want to enter into the industry. And this essentially kind of allows them the ability to kind of look across the state and figure out where are those opportunities for potential businesses and how can they as a result work with locals within those respective cities and towns to develop that potential business.
Surrounding Minnesota, every state surrounding us is recreational marijuana is illegal, and obviously we are somewhat bordering Canada, and importing marijuana in the United States is still a federal offense. So how are these businesses obtaining their resources, or how do you expect Minnesota to kind of adapt a marijuana industry if it's currently illegal to bring it into the state?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, is to always acknowledge the fact that, especially federally, it's illegal as well. What we recognize is that we know that it's not going to be kind of like a flip of the switch and dispensaries are open. We recognize that it is very much so going to be a tiered approach for being able to kind of, standing up this industry, especially those that have either, they've kind of experienced it and they've seen what's happened in other states. We're definitely learning from what other states have told us as well about all of the different steps that it takes to be able to get to that, point of sale. And so I think that's also the unique thing about this legislation and about our proposals and such, is that there are multiple licenses. So there are so many different entry points that we'll see prospective business owners entering. marketing, some of which cultivation, others on the retail side, some, different variations of that as well. I think that there are a few different spaces that we could see this taking place, but I think ultimately, we'll see cultivators be some of the people that could eventually assist in this process and ensure that, various retail and such have access. And so I think the one thing that was, very much so said, especially during the passing of the legislation last year, is Minnesotans really wanting that craft industry. And so how can people support businesses that are local? How can people work amongst one another, support various cultivators that can eventually support retail and such, to work together in order to kind of see that homegrown Minnesota industry. Once we have cultivators that are out on the ground being able to produce resources, we'll definitely see the industry pick up from there as well.
All right, and I guess my final question would be, where can Minnesotans expect the legislation to go to as of now? Because there's still a lot of gray area.
This industry is very large, and the legislation itself was also extremely large, and it touches so many different state agencies, us being the cannabis regulators, and so really looking at standing up this licensed industry and being able to get licenses out the door and business, beginning. But as you had mentioned, there is a side around public safety, and we have our colleagues over at the Department of Public Safety that are thinking some of those pieces out. There is the public health aspect, and we have folks that are thinking about how do we engage on that side and ensuring that we're educating our young people and vulnerable folks about the use of cannabis and prevention and such. And then when it comes to us specifically, it's really thinking about how do we launch this industry, how do we launch this licensing program effectively. And so we are at the legislature right now. We do have some proposals that are being discussed right now, and we're continuously working with stakeholders. We're continuously working with advocates that want to come to the table and that really want to engage on making sure that our rollout of this cannabis industry is one of the best, that it is really strengthened, and it really just reflects values of Minnesotans, especially those that did the work to really pass the legislation to begin with. And so we're working effectively right now. We want to make sure that we're able to get licenses out the door. And ultimately, I think the last thing that I would say is I encourage folks to continue to engage with us. There's a number of ways, whether you are on our website, whether you're asking either myself or some of my colleagues to come out to an event, to teach people about the cannabis industry, the Office of Cannabis Management, engage in our rulemaking process. We're going to be having a road show later on this year where we'll really be circulating that language. And then lastly, stay in tune with our website. We have a Cannabis Insider newsletter where really, I'd say it gives you the most up-to-date information about what's happening within our office, updates, and really an opportunity for us to share as many resources as possible.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us here.
Definitely, and I really appreciate you guys being willing to do this and just continuously sharing information about the good work that's happening across the state.
Our next guest is Deputy Chad Myers.
Well, I work for the Sheriff's Office, and I currently am I work a grant funded by the state as the Office of Traffic Safety DWI car. So I paid through this grant to run traffic and basically look for impaired drivers, whether that be alcohol or drugs.
Where does federal and state law conflict currently when it comes to recreational marijuana?
Well, the states can decide as far as the driving aspect of it and using marijuana. They can decide whether they're going to have what's called a per se law, meaning if you have a certain amount in your system and you reach that amount that you can be charged with a DWI in the state of Minnesota. As of now, with the legalization through Minnesota, we don't have a per se law on the books yet. There's only 5 states right now that actually have per se laws as far as driving with marijuana in your system, and those range from about 2 to 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood. And there are a lot of states like Minnesota that doesn't have a per se law at this point. But it's still technically, as long as impairment can be proven by the officer on scene, they still can be charged with the driving while impaired.
And what would be the proof to show that they are impaired?
The biggest thing we look for is if we get them pulled over is driving conduct prior to actually making the face-to-face contact. That's not always the case when you got someone that's doing something else like speeding or like an equipment violation. But we try to look for that, kind of like what you would look for with an alcohol impaired driver, the weaving in the lane and things like that. Poor judgment on distance and things. Once we have that face-to-face contact with them, obviously, like with alcohol, many times we'll have that odor of marijuana.
Right.
That will get us started as far as get us in the direction of what we might be looking for impairment. And then basically off of that, it comes down to certain things like bloodshot, watery eyes, poor depth perception, poor perception of time. When we administer some of these roadside field sobriety tests, there's a test that we do that we look at their eyelids, and their eyelids is what we call eyelid tremors, something that's not naturally seen in someone that's not impaired. A lot of times we see that the eyelid tremors in people under the influence of marijuana, as well as certain types of stimulants. And then just the overall fidgetiness of them, and the poor balance, like the swaying, the gait ataxia, where they're just kind of stumbling. Those would be the main ones that, for the most part, we look for. And then when you talk about the vital side of it, we look at high pulse rates over the course of 12 minutes. If their pulse is high, if their blood pressure is high, because marijuana is one of those strange drugs where on the outside, when you're looking at a person, they kind of look maybe droopy, slow, but on the inside, everything else is jacked up. So we talk about the pulse, we talk about the blood pressure, we talk about the respirations, things like that. All that stuff is going to be accelerated, where on the outside, looking on the outside at the person, they kind of got that sluggish look.
And you mentioned how Minnesota is one of the few states without a per se law. Is that?
Yep, that's correct. That's correct. As of now, we don't. We are actually in the process of, before we can really get a per se law, which a per se law is difficult anyway, because like with alcohol, there's going to be expected stuff you're going to see with people medically, as far as what you're going to see with their eyes and stuff like that when they're in the influence. You can have that with cannabis too, but as far as where they got to pinpoint where that per se law is, that's probably going to be the toughest thing that we have to come up with, is trying to pinpoint that. So what we're doing right now is to kind of get it going forward is what we have a pilot study going on in Minnesota, where we have a roadside oral fluid test, where it's essentially just a cheek swab. And right now it's all, we can't use it towards any cases at this point because it's just a pilot study. And it has to be, when we talk to the individual that's been placed under arrest, they've got to volunteer to be able to do it. We offer it to them. If they don't want to do it, we can't force them to do it. But we make sure that they know that their name's not attached to this or anything. It's more of just we're getting a test, and we want to see how that test is going against the test results that we get from the BCA, like the blood or urine. So that's kind of the step in the right direction to hopefully at some point get a per se law. We've got a couple different drug machines out there that we are using. There's about 60 to 70 of us in the state that have been given these machines to use at this point. And when we get done with the pilot study, they'll gather all their data and kind of see what they come up with, and see which machine we want to use, or if it's even worth using a machine at this point, kind of like what a PBT would be for alcohol.
All right, that gives us a bunch of information right off the bat. I do want to dive a little bit into overall encounters and handling when it comes to people with marijuana. I believe the law that passed that allowed for recreational marijuana was announced sometime late May and early June. From that point onwards, prior to August 1st, did you notice an increase with encounters of people under the influence of marijuana or in possession of marijuana? Did you notice a decrease? Did it not change? And did you notice an increase after the law was in effect on August 1st?
And quite honestly, I don't think we've seen, at least down in this area, in southeast Minnesota, and particularly Winona County, we haven't seen a drastic uptick in it at this point. I think everyone thought, myself as well, thought maybe once August 1st come around, we were going to see a huge uptick in this. But we haven't, and the reason why is, even though they've legalized it, dispensaries are not out yet. So these places that want to be able to sell it got to get their licensure and all this stuff to hold their dispensaries, because the average person that's never done it before that would like to try it, they don't know where to get it from. I think once that happens, once dispensaries start opening up and the common person that's never done it before but would like to try it can go in and know where they can purchase this, I think you're probably going to see a sharp spike in that first year right after the dispensaries open up. This is something unlike alcohol, this is something a lot of people haven't ever done before, so they don't know what the tolerance level is, and they may take more than what is recommended, things like that. Overall, for the most part, I wouldn't say if there has been an increase, it's been very, very, very minimal up to this point.
It sounds like, as of now, when you stop someone, it's usually because they're driving while under the influence or they're using machinery, which are both illegal still. But let's say the individual was caught with marijuana prior to August 1st. What happens to those individuals that were charged or found in possession or under the influence prior to August 1st?
A lot of it depends on the county that it occurs in, but I know as far as Winona County, when they saw that this was going to be legalized, it was just a matter of time. A lot of the laws, that even though they were still in effect, they kind of were, I wouldn't say brushed aside or pushed aside, but it wasn't as pushed as forth as far as going to court or charging them out or anything, just because we knew it was going to be legalized at some point. So I think there was kind of a buffer zone there before it actually became legalized. And when we started finding this stuff where it's kind of like, well, it's going to be legal here soon. So I think a lot of the prosecutors around were kind of maybe hesitant simply because of workload that would come in with that. Other counties probably do stuff differently. State Patrol does stuff a little bit differently. But as far as like the city of Winona and Winona County, it was kind of one of those things where they kind of started backing off the closer it got to the legalization of marijuana, simply because now you're gonna fill the courts up with all these petty misdemeanor cases or misdemeanor cases even, and for what? For something that now it's going to be legalized, and now you're gonna have to try to argue that. So that was a lot of what we saw in the several months leading up to the legalization of recreational marijuana.
The thing is, though, when they have marijuana, they weren't only breaking Minnesota state law, but they were breaking federal law. Could they still be charged on a federal level then?
They could be, but again, it comes back to how much work you want to put into something. The feds are giving the state that option to be able to control whether they want to legalize recreational marijuana or not. So it basically falls mostly under the state. Now, when you start getting into bigger cases where we're talking major felonies, things like that, then that's a different story. That goes a different direction. There is kind of that gray area there with the federal and the state, but for the most part, the power is more given to the state about what they want to do with this.
I did talk to some people, and I heard that Minnesota is not entirely clear on how they would handle cases of underage use of marijuana as of now. Is that true?
Yeah. At this point, I think it just kind of comes down to whoever wants to jump in the ring first and try a case and kind of see where it goes. It's kind of the same way when we talk about, people driving under the influence of marijuana. When it's just marijuana itself and we don't have a per se law, how does someone go about doing that? Is kind of the biggest question. So I think a lot of prosecutors are just kind of waiting to see if someone else does something that kind of points everyone in the right direction of where would we go with this. And that's probably the biggest challenge we've had right now as far as law enforcement, as far as courts and the judiciary system. Just trying to figure out how we're going to go about doing this, because it's such a big change right now in Minnesota, and right. Everyone's trying to get used to it, and it's new for everyone. It's new for law enforcement. It's new for the public, things like that. So, there's a lot of kinks that's got to get worked out, and it's probably going to get a little bit tougher before it gets easier. But I think in the end we'll eventually find something. It's just a matter of when and who's gonna be that first one to jump into the ring and say this is what we're gonna do as far as a county or something.
What do you believe would happen should someone actually find, say, an 18-year-old or 17-year-old using marijuana and they decided to pursue dealing with that through the legal matter?
I think the toughest part is when you're talking about an 18-year-old, you're still talking about a legal adult. And I think that's where a lot of people get caught up. I know they got the law of 21 for alcohol, and they've got the law of 21 for marijuana. You're going to have people that are going to say they're a legal adult. They still technically could make their own minds up. But then you're going to have another side say, maybe, but at 18, the brain is still developing for someone that's a young adult, and it's not usually fully developed to their 25. How is this going to affect someone that's 18 years old that smokes for 7 years before their brain's fully developed? Is there going to be something there that stunts that person?
Right.
I'm kind of up in the air. I don't have like a clear cut, this is what I think they should do thing. I like to keep all angles open and listen to it. I get the idea of someone that's 18, and just like they said, alcohol as well too, because alcohol used to be 18 years of age before they bumped it up to 21. Mm-hmm. The people are still young, their brains are still developing. How much of an effect does that have, putting substances in your body that the body's not used to being in there? As far as what they're going to do, I don't know. It's still such a gray area, and it's kind of like walking through the dark with blinders on, just kind of feeling our way around till we can find something that works and is accepted and proven in society.
I do want to talk a little more on the restrictions that are currently on the recreational marijuana for the average civilian. One of the requirements for people who have it is they have to keep it, and this comes directly from the Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management. It has to be hidden from public view in a locked space that is not open to the public. That's not open to public view. How would, say, you or police departments handle it if you did see a plant in someone's, say, like living room window?
I think it would be if it's reported to us, and obviously it's a violation against the state statute which has been put out there. We would look at it as possibly a verbal warning, because the laws are so new. Maybe a lot of people don't know what they are. There's kind of that buffer area to allow them to adjust to the laws, but if they continue then to fail to abide by them as well, then at some point action taken as far as whether that be citations or whatnot.
If someone decides to use marijuana, right, let's say they just use it recreationally and they're still abiding by the law after August 1st, would it harm their chances of being hired by a police department or other forms of law enforcement?
Oh, I believe it would probably make it a little bit more difficult. Again, we're talking about a gray area here where now it's legal just like alcohol. If you went and told that anyone that applied for this job can't drink alcohol, how many people are you going to get to apply for any position of any kind, right?
Right.
So I think the issue is going to be, as far as if they're doing random tests like this, are they going to have that Delta 9, which is the impairing substance, that Delta 9 THC in their system at all times? Because that's the impairing substance, and that's what burns off rather quickly. And then when we do blood or urine tests 2-3 weeks later, and they're still coming back with that metabolite in there, that's just the metabolite that, because it's fat soluble, it gets into the fat and stays in there. Is it causing that person to become impaired or be impaired? Absolutely not. You're going to be able to allowed to use marijuana and go into law enforcement. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I don't see it happening. But then again, I mean, there are ways around it as well too. So,
where do you see the legalization process of marijuana going? What do you think is going to change in the future?
I hope that we can come up with some sort of per se law. If we get someone that's driving under the influence, it'll make the cases that much easier, and the easier it is, the less complex it is, the less chance that we're clogging up the justice system with all these cases, which is kind of what's happening right now because we don't have it. I think it will come at some point. I don't know when, if it's anytime soon, if it's going to be in my career or years down the road. But I'm hoping that does come to a point that we can get to that where we can sit there and say, this is the legal limit. If you're above it, the letter of the law says you're going to be charged with it. As far as everything else, as far as it being charged, I think it's going to remain controlled. My opinion, I think after they have a couple years of this and see how everything's going, maybe they will loosen up some of these a little bit, some of these laws to allow maybe more. But I think right now you need to have a starting point, and you need to have something just says this is what we're starting at, this is what we're allowing, and now we're gonna almost like a trial run. Now we're gonna see where it goes.
I do want to thank you for your time, Sherriff, and thank you for doing this interview with us.
I appreciate it, and anytime you ever want to get together and talk more about this, I would be more than happy.
Thanks again to all the individuals who joined us today on Culture Clique. To stay up to date on the regulations surrounding marijuana, go to cannabis.mn.gov. Be sure to tune in next Thursday at 12:30 for episode 5 of our series, Legalizing Recreational Marijuana in Minnesota, where we hear from everyday people on their thoughts following the legalization. I'm Giovanni Bermudez.
Creating cultural awareness and understanding. You've been listening to Culture Clique. Support for Culture Clique is made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Culture Clique is produced by KQAL-FM on the campus of Winona State University. For more information, look us up on the web at kqal.org. And thanks for listening to Culture Clique.